It's still Good Morning Nigeria, and we're live on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority. Now, before we commence our conversation, which is the ongoing electoral reform by way of amendment to the existing Electoral Act, let's listen into this background put together by our correspondent, Abdulsalam Jibril.
It is just over a year and 5 months to the commencement of the 2023 general elections, and political activities across the country have begun to take shape. Concerned by violence, ballot box snatching, and other electoral malfeasance that have over time characterized elections in the country, the Senate in 2019 initiated fresh moves to address these challenges through a rejig of the 2010 Electoral Act. The Electoral Act, under amendment by the Ninth National Assembly, seeks to repeal and reenact the 2010 Electoral Act. A major provision in the Act provides for an Electoral Offences Commission saddled with the responsibility of prosecuting electoral offenders. This is expected to address the challenges relating to election-related violence. The Act also seeks to resolve issues concerning Inec's introduction of modern technologies into the electoral process, particularly accreditation of voters, electronic voting, and electronic transmission of results from polling units. Some of the other key electoral issues contained in the Act borders on financial independence of the electoral umpire, new timelines for submission of lists of candidates, expenses for presidential candidates and independent candidacy, among others. Some experts maintain that when the Amendment Act becomes law, it will go a long way towards addressing electoral issues and ensure a freer, fairer, and credible election, as well as record significant reduction in election-related violence. However, since the public hearing in December 2020 and the retreat to consolidate citizens' feedback into the Electoral Amendment Bill in late January 2021, the bill is yet to be passed. While Nigerians await the passage and subsequent presidential assent to the Electoral Act Amendment Bill, will it sanitize Nigeria's electoral process going forward? Guests on the program will speak to these and more shortly.
And now in the studio with us to talk more on the issues in electoral reforms in Nigeria is the former Director of Voter Education and Publicity, Inec, Oluwole Osaze Uzi. We thank you for coming, sir.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
And also here with us in the studio is the Head of Programs at the Center for Democracy and Development, Timipere Allison. It's good to have you this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and also here with us in the studios, we would like to welcome Professor Sadiq Abba, who is, of course, Deputy Vice Chancellor in charge of administration at the University of Abuja. Prof. Abba, delighted to have you again on Good Morning Nigeria.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Okay. And joining us via Zoom for this conversation is Samson Itodo. Samson Itodo, of course, is the Executive Director of IAGA Africa. Sam, delighted to have you on Good Morning Nigeria.
The pleasure is mine. Good morning.
All right, so gentlemen, once again, you're welcome to this edition of Good Morning Nigeria. Since the Fourth Republic, we have had several elections in Nigeria, 2003, 2007, 2011, and of course 2015. And in 2010, there was an electoral reform, which of course paved the way for some of the innovations brought in by Inec with respect to 2015, 2011 and 2015 elections. But of course, all said and done, Nigeria has seen that there is more need for electoral reforms, and as we get towards the 2023 general elections. And the first question to ask, if you ask me, is actually to see the critical issues in Nigeria's electoral reform. I'd like to start with Osaze Uzi. What are those critical issues in the nation's electoral reform?
Thank you, Kieran. There are lots of issues, but I guess the most pressing, the most burning issue for a lot of Nigerians is the issue of the injection of technology, more technology into the electoral process. It will appear Inec was ahead of the National Assembly of the lawmakers when they introduced, for example, the card reader. And just as one of the steps in the issue of introduction of technology, the steps started as far back as 2006, if I'm not mistaken, and that is when the first attempt towards getting our register into an electronic register, because there are building blocks to everywhere you're going to go to, even in technology, especially in technology. If you're going to have electronic voting, for example, which a lot of Nigerians are clamoring for, those building blocks must be there in the first place. You need an electronic register. Electronic register cleaned up the old manual register where people had 200 cards, 500 cards, or you could buy cards and it was not biometric. There was no biometrics. There was no unique identifying features in the old register. Now we have a biometric register. Fortunately, that was within the province of Inec in the sense that the Electoral Act gave Inec the latitude and leeway to do what he wanted to do in terms of registration of voters. So Inec did that. That's the first step, get registration of voters. The next thing was that, look, okay, now we have the electronic register, and which you could sieve through. You ran AFIS to ensure that there was not multiple registration, double or multiple registration. So that was the first step. Then they went on, okay, now that you have a register, where do you go to from here? Because, for example, you cannot get into electronic voting without an electronic register. Then you also need electronic accreditation or access to the ballot. How do you do that? Then Inec introduced the card reader. Now that card reader, now the Electoral Act is quite detailed about how you go about this issue of accreditation. And rightly, wrongly, it said the way you accredit is to tick the voters register. You tick the register, and that shows the number of people who have accredited. Inec thought, no, let us, that ticking, there can be mistakes, there can be just whimsical ticking of the registers, so let us see how we can improve on that process. They introduced the card reader. And unfortunately, when the case went to the tribunal and eventually got to the Supreme Court, the Court said, no, you cannot go with your guidelines and contradict what the Act says. The Act of lawmaking is for the National Assembly. And National Assembly people have said this is what it should be. So that is what a big obstacle to the deployment of technology in terms of that issue. Similarly, in voting, there is a manual process. The Electoral Act is basically a manual document. You cannot build an electronic superstructure on a manual document. So Nigerians say, look, let us overhaul this document and say, introduce more technology. The world has moved so far in commerce, in trade, in entertainment. Technology is the backbone of all that we do now. So why should the electoral process be left behind? So technology is one of the, injection of technology is one of the main things. Issues, each time we have elections, there are always issues coming up. In one of the burning issues of 2019, Inec withheld certificates of several quote-unquote winners of elections. For example, in Imo, at least 2 senators did not get sworn in when their colleagues did. Inec said, no, we can't do this. The Electoral Act says there should be a return. A return is a voluntary act going through a process. And when you have satisfied all those processes, then you are entitled to a certificate certifying that you have won the election based on the rules and the regulations and the law of the land. Allegedly, one of the returning officers, a gun was put to his head. He was threatened. And that being the case, you can't say his return was out of a valid process, and you cannot say that that was a voluntary decision made by him. It was under duress, under threat. So, look, said this is something that is creeping in. It didn't happen just in Imo. About 3 states or 3 constituencies where this happened. So Nigerians said, and Inec felt, no, this is wrong. It should be a voluntary act when you have passed through the process. If you were to get married now, the law recognizes that if you held a gun to your partner's head and said, come and sign this document to show you are married, that can be invalidated because marriage, like someone said, is a voluntary act. So that's akin to a Electoral Act develop along lines that other parts of the law have developed in. These are some of the basic issues. There's concern about electoral spending. and limits on campaign finance. There are lots of issues about that. Should the electoral process be left to money bags, people who can afford to? Should we go to a system where there's matching grants? One time, Inec was giving grants to political parties, but we now found that this seemed to be fueling divisions and crises within the party. So we said, look, let us make a recommendation to the National Assembly. That was removed. Inec no longer gives grants to political parties. Now, elections are expensive. If there are no grants from government, you have to find a way of funding your activities. No problem with that. The legitimate use of money. You need to print posters, you need to pay your agents, you need to do logistics. So much has to be done. You have to pay for airtime, to get your messages across. But it is bad influence of money, corrupting influence of money, where money bags come and hijack sponsor candidates and hijack resources of the state. That's where the problem is. So these are just some of the things we would like to flag as part of the issues in electoral reform.
All right. Thank you very much, Oluwole Swaze, for those initial comments on issues relevant to electoral reform. Samson Itodo, I know your organization has also been at the forefront pushing for electoral reform. We're not there yet, but what are those pertinent issues, aside from what Osaze has already indicated?
Well, thanks. And it's great to see Barrister Ozie and Professor Sadiq Abba. Good morning, Nigerians. I think Barrister Uzi has highlighted some of the key issues that citizens have advocated for as part of the reforms to the electoral process, and I completely agree with him on the 3 or 4 points that he made. That's the reflection of the aggregate opinion of Nigerians on where we think that the issues that the reform should address. But just to add a couple, there's the issue around the independence of Inec, and this is related to the financial independence of Inec. If you look at what happened in the 2019 elections, where the executive failed to release the funding for the election early enough, in fact, as at November of 2018, that was when the outstanding balance of the budget was released for the Electoral Commission to conduct the 2019 elections, and that adversely affects elections. And so, in the current amendment process, the push is to have a specific provision within the law that says funding for the commission to conduct general elections should be released at least 1 year before the elections. I would have even said even earlier than that, but I think it's an acceptable provision that yes, at least by 1 year the Electoral Commission should have its funding. So that's one of the issues. The second critical issue, was around the cost of the limits for campaign expenditure. And the need to curb the influence of money in our politics. Although the proposal tends to increase the campaign spending limits, we've called on the National Assembly and also the committees to revisit that. So you don't put or peg prohibitive thresholds that make it difficult for young people, women, and persons with disability to vie for office, because the current proposal, to a large extent, undermines the aspiration of this economically disadvantaged populations in our society. The third critical issue, which Uzi talked about, was around electoral technology, and in this case, electronic voting as well as electronic transmission of results. And we, have advocated that yes, there is need to make those provisions within the law, but the law shouldn't be too prescriptive. So you don't conscript the Electoral Commission, but in this case, INEC, with the law. So things like procedures should be left at the discretion of the Electoral Commission, because we believe that electronic transmission of results will enhance and deepen the integrity of the electoral process. The other critical issue which we've also talked about was on the candidate nomination process, how do we sanitize the process and make it difficult for politicians to undermine, the entire candidate selection process, and particularly with respect to delegates, with respect to the regulatory powers of Inec, and whether Inec should have the power to reject a list of candidates submitted to it by political parties, where those candidates have not emerged from validly conducted primaries. And our position is, given the position of the Supreme Court in the Zamfara case, it is expedient on the National Assembly to amend the law to give INEC, the power to reject nominations, a list of candidates, where those candidates do not emerge from validly conducted primaries. And we believe that, this regulatory power can shape the character of politicians and define and perhaps fundamentally reform, the candidate nomination process. The last point that I'd like to add on this, on the issues for electoral reform, relates to the role of security agencies and how do we ensure that, yes, even though INEC, based on the existing provision, that INEC has the power to request and also develop the plan for the deployment of security agencies, but there is need to recalibrate that provision under Section 29 of the 2015 Amendment Act to specifically, provide things like sanctions in cases where you have security officials circumvent the electoral process. So these are some of the issues that we've highlighted in addition to the points that Barrister Uzi has made.
All right, thank you, Mr. Itodo. We'll get back to you. Now, let's return to the studio here, where we have the Vice Chancellor of the University of Abuja, Professor Sadiq.
Deputy Vice Chancellor.
Deputy Vice Chancellor, yes. Let's get your take on the need for continuous election reforms in Nigeria, and what are those gray areas that should be of concern?
Okay, thank you very much. I will build on what Ozi and Todo said, and I think both INEC and the National Assembly are doing great jobs as far as creating an election framework that is of standard and that can meet a minimum international acceptability. I think, be this as it may, if you look at Nigeria contextually, I think the most fundamental issue in electoral reforms is missing, and that is the citizen. So we talk about the Electoral Act. We have been doing it for quite some time, and we're doing it good. And there's a progression as far as this electoral is concerned. There's improvement every now and then. We talk about regulations, electoral regulations, rules and regulations by INEC. I don't know, Ozi will be able to tell me there's a document given to political parties and stakeholders on elections. And every now and then, on election cycle, INEC sit down with stakeholders and improve on this particular document. So there's a lot of work. But what is missing from the point of view of elections in Nigeria is the ability and the capacity of the of the powers that be now to put their searchlight on an average Nigerian citizen. On election day, only citizens vote. And in a real sense of the word, election days are not voting days. They are decision-making days. So only citizens take such decisions. You can rig votes, but you will never rig decisions of an average citizen. So I think what we should do as a nation or as a country, as far as our elections are concerned, is to make sure that from the point of view of the Electoral Act, rules and regulations by INEC, as well as the voter education, voter mobilization, and voter sensitization, we should be able to now focus on how to improve the electoral fortunes and the political educations of an average Nigerian citizen. And if you do this, at least it will go a long way to at least reduce about 50 to 70% of all elections problems in Nigeria. So, and who are responsible for that? INEC is there as a stakeholder, the National Assembly, the executive arm of government itself is there, the political parties. Now, here, I think in the last 10 years, INEC had done a lot to make sure that our parties are now transformed from just being mere political structures into a democratic institutions in Nigeria. They were engaged variously by INEC on, at least through seminars, workshops, trainings, capacity buildings, etc., etc. So I think political parties are central, are primary as far as these processes are concerned. So the citizens is very key. The parties are key to the success stories of these particular electoral reforms. And most important, like it also says, the security, election security is very, very important. So if Nigeria will place a lot of premium on these three things, I think in the next elections we will be able to now celebrate the outcomes. Because most of the time, if it is not all those who went to vote on that day are voting wisely or are making decisive decisions on behalf of themselves and the nation at large.
Professor Sadiq, I would like you to clarify this point. I mean, I liked what you said, that you can rig votes, but you can't rig citizens' decisions. Yeah. And that there ought to be a place for the citizens in the electoral process. This citizen-centric disposition that you are advocating, how then do you reduce that into clauses in an electoral act or provisions in regulations by the electoral management body? Exactly what do you have in mind as to taking into cognizance the role, wishes, interests, and intentions of the citizen in the electoral reform process?
You see, first and foremost, anybody can vote, including a monkey. If you train a monkey, it's just a thumbprint, it's voting. But when you go to a polling unit, consciously, the difference between a voter and a decision maker is the consciousness. If the nation and all the stakeholders in the electoral process are able to fine-tune the mentality of an average Nigerian citizen on the importance and relevance and the importance of what he or she is going to do that day at that particular time, that is a decision. You have turned that particular individual not only as a subject of elections or as a prisoner of democracy or as a slave of the process. You have turned him or her into a conscious being who is proud of his or her own citizenship and is conscious of the duty that is imposed on him or on her that particular moment. So that's the idea. And you can do so through the Constitution, you can do so through the Electoral Act, you can do so through INEC election process and procedures, election guidelines. That's the document that INEC, through election guidelines. And you can also do so through streamlining the activities and responsibilities of political parties to the citizens. So, it's, like you have said, it's a citizen-centered voting model, whereby every process or procedures of the election is geared towards identifying and celebrating the importance of that particular individual who is going to vote. So in other climes of the world, at least they place a lot of emphasis on to make sure that you are consciously mobilized, you are consciously educated, adequately educated on that particular responsibility, etc., etc. So, and if you look at all the process for the past 10, 15 years in Nigeria, it is that particular citizens' consciousness that is missing in Nigeria. And if including the security who are being used, rightly or wrongly during election days, if they are citizens, they are not subject to that process. They won't be able to be, they will never allow somebody, politician or at the executive arm of government, to use them. You're talking about judiciary, who become the, what do you call it, the gatekeepers of who wins and who loses in an election. So they themselves, if they are consciously mobilized towards that particular destination, then everything will now fall rightly. So that is the essence of the citizens-driven election system or model.
All right, Prof. Let's bring in Timmy Perales in here. You've listened to other guests raise very important points with respect to issues in Nigeria's electoral reforms. Let's get your own views.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the position of CDD is well aligned with the positions already canvassed by the speakers before me, and I'm happy to see that we are really agreed. For CDD, number one is the application of technology across the voting spectrum. So for us, it is not just...
All right, Tim Allison, let's pause you there because we're having issues with your audio line. We'll get that fixed in a moment and we will return to you.
Well, Kieran, thanks. Let's, in the meantime, bring in Oluwole Osaze-Ozi. Wale, let's take an aspect of the introduction of ICT into the electoral process. Just one aspect. And this aspect, of course, relates to the virtual tail end of it, what has been in the news lately, namely electronic transmission of results. Now, there's often a conflation between electronic transmission of results and electronic voting. And sometimes this conflation you hear from members of the legislature. So could you clarify this for our audience? To say, look, what is electronic voting and what is electronic transmission of results?
I think it's very important. I have observed that as well. There's a lot of misunderstanding. Generally, it's accepted that there's something called electronic voting. People confuse electronic voting with electronic balloting. Electronic voting really consists of several things in the process. I referenced the register of voters now, biometric register of voters. You also have the PVC, permanent voters card, which is a smart card, which has your unique identifying features, your photograph, your thumbprint, and everything, your details in that card. Now, that is used for the accreditation or access to the ballot. So you have that. Then the third component will be electronic balloting. That's when you now vote. You now make your choice, as it were. And then after making your choice, there's a fourth component, which is the transmission of the results to a central server or up to the point where there's a declaration. Presently in the Electoral Act, you come there manually, you get, I said, electronically you are registered. Electronically you are accredited because of the card reader. But then the Supreme Court has nailed that and look, until the law is amended, you cannot you can use the PVC, but to complement, you cannot supersede. And that's the most important thing. And the Supreme Court actually acknowledged the benefits of using a process that enhances its integrity. But said, look, go back and amend the law. We are not lawmakers. We cannot, in as much as we want to, we cannot amend the law. Inec cannot amend the law. Go back to the lawmakers, because that power has been donated to the National Assembly by the Constitution of the land. So it is them who can amend the law. So that is that accreditation, giving you access, so that there will not be indiscriminate voting. Then you come to the actual voting, the actual making the choice. And some people want that to be electronic. The reform bill now does not make provision for electronic voting. I think we have to be clear on that one. Current controversy is actually transmission of results. And recall in Edo that was discussed, but they didn't transmit results, but you could see the results real time as they were going there, so that if the manual transmitted results contradicts that of the electronic, people will raise an alarm, that kind of a thing. So the present bill talked about the transmission, but there's controversy. The speaker yesterday denied that, he's not aware. I think it wasn't a clear-cut denial. The editors captured it as a denial, but it wasn't a clear-cut denial. He said he was not aware. It's in the realm of speculation. He did not confirm, neither did he deny. I think Nigerians have to be very careful about that. He didn't deny. Unfortunately, none of us has been officially privy to that report or the joint committee. But I think Nigerians should be very, very conscious. And I think most stations carry that the speaker denied. No, he said it's in the realm of speculation. It's an important distinction. So those are the four components of what generally is termed electronic voting. So the bill does not talk about voting. There are lots of issues concerning the actual voting, but it's transmission of results that Nigerians
What is this transmission of results? Now, some persons have also claimed, because I recall when we did the review of those off-cycle elections where there was some relative electronic transmission of results.
Yes.
It went beyond text messages to say you sent a text message of a result from a polling unit to another. It seems to be such, a seamless process that for you to intervene, then you must actually be a professional hacker. But the evidence of your hacking will be so manifest as to, be proof of some finagling. So again, what is electronic transmission of results? Just to say, look, how does it go from the actual voting, let's say physical voting now, not physical voting, manual voting, to the collation point or to the headquarters, where everybody who can log in. I think your Inec at that time advised to log in, and they were seeing the results coming up.
Real time,
yes.
correct.
Yes.
Now, these are all part of the complexities. It can be complex, but it can be simplified. So let's try and simplify it for ourselves. There are different ways you can transmit results electronically. In 2007, people don't realize that the Inec tried to transmit results electronically. But what did it do? It gave SIM cards to polling officers and said, text the results. Now, in texting, you can make mistakes. But you know that our technological backbone was not as strong as it is today. It's not where it is, should be, but it's not. But I think we had 2G at that time. It could not take scanned copies, for example, and go. What Inec, as far as I'm aware, is doing is scanning the EC8A, the result sheets, scanning that thing and sending it to the server, sending it that everybody can see the scanned result, the manual, physically filled paper result. Because don't forget, the law as it stands now is that we should fill that form, which is a physically paper. Although some people argue that, well, why not? These days you can do electronic signature, so you can fill it in electronically and get the agents available to sign those things and do it electronically. Now, if you had electronic voting, there are different models. A machine can actually do your voting and also automatically transmit that result. That is another way. But you could also, with the present position now, scan the results and transmit it. And that's where in Edo, Ondo, people were saying things. And I think it will also be done in Anambra, where you scan the actual result sheet. So you can screenshot it, or you can save it, or whatever else, people see it. So that's the transmission. Transmission can be either way, but that is the model which Nigeria seems to have chosen. When we get full electronically throughout the whole process, then one machine that in which you indicate your choice can also transmit that result.
Yeah, I was actually coming to that. I was going to ask you, what is obtainable in other crimes. I've already said it clearly that there's a lot of complexities in that. But when we have a reform that will say, look, let's go totally electronic voting, that is where all these components you're talking about are going to come in, if I understand you clearly. All right, let's bring it more back again to me, Allison. Let's get your take. Let's get to your opening remarks with regard to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know the conversation has moved forward, so I'll be quick. So CDD's position aligns with the positions already laid by the previous speakers. One, we believe that technology has to be applied across the spectrum of voting, from accreditation to voting and the transmission of results. So we are very strong on that, and we are so happy that currently the majority of the populace also support this decision. And over the years, Inec has shown the capacity to integrate technology, so why not do it now? We know we have a young democracy, and this is time for us to begin to lay these very critical foundations that we can build upon. The legislators have expressed fears about cyber security and integrity of electronically done elections, particularly with the transmission. But as Osaze has noted, there shouldn't be so much of a challenge. If we have a proper system, probably the blockchain system for running such critical election infrastructure, we provide some kind of protection for the integrity of the outcome. But besides that, we also have machines that can provide paper trails, so like a paper record of everything that has happened electronically. So a valid result, therefore, would be one where both the electronically transmitted results agree with the paper trail that can be compared. And then also, independence for Inec is very critical to CDD. We observe elections almost all the time, since the start of this democratic experience. And we have noticed that a lot of the delays, for example, those postponements that INEC had to do in the past few elections were related to inability of the system to provide the fund when needed. So in this current bill, our position is that INEC must have independence financially, and also there must be a clear statement saying when this fund should be released. And we agree that it should be at least on a yearly basis, if not even 6 monthly. And then also the aspect of a limit on campaign financing. CDD has been making a case for not allowing money-back politics to dominate our political landscape. Women, youth, and people with disability have always been financially disadvantaged. And when you up the limit, then you create huge hurdles to these disadvantaged groups of people who can no longer acquire the ticket or the nomination of the already established political parties. And then again, you increase the war chest of these political parties. Vote buying is quite an issue. Many times we've observed elections, we saw in units, political parties pay as much as 20,000 naira to buy the votes of each voter. And if you make them have a lot of money, like the presidential election as alleged, they can spend as much as 15 billion, then you create huge challenge. So our position is that there should be a downward review. We know the current limits may not be feasible. Elections are expensive, but we mustn't have a situation where the elections become a game for the highest bidder. Thank you.
All right, Timmy Prey Allison, thank you very much there for your opening salvo. We'll come back to you because of the conversation. Back again to Samson Itodo. Samson Itodo, I want to get your comments on the issue around electronic transmission of results. Wale has very competently made a distinction between electronic voting, which is not on the cards, and electronic transmission of results. So one question to ask would be, what would be lost if in the current amendment exercise we didn't then have a provision relating to the electronic transmission of results? That's one. The next question would be, I get concerned, by the way, when it appears that for virtually every conceivable step or stage in the electoral process, we appear to have a provision in the electoral law or even in the guidelines. So couldn't we have, say, an electoral act where through a drafting technique, you can have an omnibus clause that relates to the infusion or the use of ICT? Must you not begin to break it down? I mean, my colleague Kirian is a tech buff. So must you begin to reduce it to say, this is what you must use. Today you must use WhatsApp. Assuming you put Twitter there, and Twitter has been suspended now by the federal government, and Twitter is not available, you were to have election tomorrow, what would you do? So couldn't we, in terms of drafting, that's to say not to the National Assembly, just place an omnibus clause and then leave it to the discretion of INEC to operate within what is known at the time, and if disputes arise, it is now left for the judiciary to say, oh yeah, within what we know and within what the law provides, you acted well or you acted wrongly.
Well, Chief Kirian, it will be inconceivable to conclude this process, this amendment process, without provisions that confer legality on electronic transmission of results. I think that if you look through the entire sort of proposals that have been advanced on electoral reforms, they are what we call principal or fundamental pillars of this ongoing reform process, and one of them is this electronic transmission of results. And so I honestly, I would say that if the National Assembly decides to reject this idea and this particular provision, it will be doing, one, our electoral process a great disservice, and it will be in contravention of the responsibility that they've been saddled with. And Nigerians have spoken, and there's broad-based consensus that electronic transmission of results should be integrated into our electoral process. But the point also needs to be made that the whole concept of electronic transmission is not to substitute the manual transmission, it's to complement the manual transmission, because we know machines have vulnerabilities. They can break down. There could be hacks, like we've talked about. But we believe that, if you have the electronic transmitted result as well as the manual, both of them serve as a check on each other. And that's why this current assembly needs to ensure that in the interest of electoral integrity, the transmission of results should be retained to complement the manual process. And once it is transparent, it inspires public confidence. Look at what happened in Edo and Ondo with the Inec election results viewing portal. It did, enhance the integrity of the process. And then it also guarantees the acceptability of electoral outcomes, especially where you have very high tensed electoral competition, or even in a divided society like Nigeria. So this transparency is very critical and is important. The point you made about drafting, I agree with you that INEC the law should be drafted in a way that it provides omnibus clauses, and then INEC can, via subsidiary legislation or delegated legislation, draft guidelines in furtherance of its constitutional responsibility. Yes, good, grant INEC the discretion, but we must also ensure that there are limits to keep the discretionary powers that INEC has in check. So it is not arbitrarily applied or the power is abused. Those are my views. I think that the challenge has always been over legislation. To what extent? And this challenge is a dilemma that legislators, draftsmen actually grapple with across the world. So it's not peculiar to Nigeria. It's just the major issue to consider is it is in whose interest a particular position is taken. Is it in the public interest, or it serves the interest of the lawmakers? Or which position, whatever position that is taken, seeks to address a mischief and a gap within the existing law. And my sense is the public interest should be the overriding principle and goal that underpins, this legislation or electoral reforms. And if you look at, for instance, this whole point about timelines for elections, if you look at the current bill and the proposal, there are extensive reviews that have been proposed to the timelines. One for the conduct of primaries, for voter registration, for the period of campaigns. Now, these timelines are germane to our process because they would address the logistical challenges posed by the unrealistic timelines that we have in our current Electoral Act. So if you look at notice of elections based on the proposal from the committee, and because the IGA Africa has been deeply involved in this process and even supported the committees at some points, was that the notice of election will be issued 360 days before the date of elections. And then the submission of list of candidates should be submitted to INEC 180 days before the day of elections. As it is today, it's 90 days. It is too close to the date of elections. So before INEC concludes with the printing of ballot papers and result sheets, and then there's substitution of candidate or publication of list of candidates, we're already close to the elections. And so this current proposal to extend the time to about 180 days is a fantastic proposal that will give time for INEC as an institution, as well as even political parties, to resolve all issues relating to candidate selection or candidate nomination. So INEC would have sufficient time to plan. So we don't end up postponing elections at the dying minute just because we are unable to produce result sheets or ballot papers that carry the logos of parties, where parties at the dying minute substitute candidates or their conflicting judgments. I think also tied to this, is that this duality of jurisdiction that courts share, which has led, to conflicting judgments that have, disrupted elections and also negatively impacted on INEC's preparations as well as stakeholder preparations for elections. And the proposal is, if you look at, the High Court of the state as well as the Federal High Court, they all have, coordinate jurisdiction on pre-election matters. And how do you ensure that you address this issue where this coordinates jurisdiction that both courts have, and that has resulted to conflicting judgments be addressed? And the proposal by the in the draft that we have seen is to confer exclusive jurisdiction to the Federal High Court on some issues relating to either eligibility of candidates or as it relates to pre-election matters. I know there are debates on these issues. Lawyers will not agree, but I think that it opens up the conversation on how we resolve issues relating to conflicting judgments that come from the court that impugns on INEC's ability and independence to conduct elections, as well as affecting, the conduct of other stakeholders in the electoral process. But also, it also increases the cost of elections.
Well, thank you, Itudo. You have actually touched on many other pertinent issues relating to this particular conversation, going to the judgments by courts of equal jurisdiction and what have you. That's very important. But let me take us back to the issue of electronic transmission of results, because one of the major issues in the nation's election is not just the voting, but collation and transmission of results. Between voting point and collation point, that's where we usually have some discrepancies, that of course affect the authenticity of whatever result that is coming from a particular voting point. So let's bring in Sadiq Haba once more to give us his own view with respect to electronic transmission of votes. Osaze has already given us an idea of the differentiation between electronic voting and electronic transmission of results. So what are your views?
First and foremost, I think we should be able to have a clear, define our realities as Nigerians. We have to contextualize this result, what is called transmission of results electronically. First and foremost, you look at the budget involves, because it involves a lot of technologies. And two, apart from the machines, apart from the budgets which provides the machines, look at the capacity of this ad hoc staff that conducts the election for and on behalf of INEC. They need to be trained and retrained. And you see, this election is only one day. You see, in election cycle, that day is only one. There is pre-elections and post-elections. So if you concentrate so much energies on that single day, I'm not saying that the day is not important.
You said that there's a day of decision.
Yes, it's a day of decision. But the preparatory period is so important than that actual day. So also the post-elections, what comes after the election day. So if you say, now, I'm not against transmission of results electronically, but do we have the financial capacity to engage in this venture? Do we have the human capacity, human capital available on ground to operate those particular processes? And three, also, the Nigerian voters, are they adequately prepared for this process? So if you look, if all these questions, if you look at it, you see that there are negatives. Because financially, the government is not in a position to fund this transmission. Because even ordinary INEC budget is becoming a bit difficult for the government to release. Mm-hmm. So if INEC now impose further financial on government expenses, it's not going to be realistic. I think my advice for Nigeria is that we should not just keep on jumping the gun because country A, B, C, D are doing it. We must also do it. So at least let's take it one at a time. Let's get things right so that at least once we reach there, we'll do it perfectly. Mm-hmm. But as it is now, I'm very sorry sound very pessimistic. I don't think we are ready and prepared to start this electronic transmission of results. Let's move. Look, we have come a long way, and kudos to Inec for having the courage and the capacity to introduce even these biometrics, smart card reader, etc. As a Nigerian, I feel proud.
But this issue of manipulation of results, and that is actually part of the reason why some Nigerians are yearning for electronic transmission of results from the voting point to the central server.
Show me one single country that operates electronic transfer of results that is foolproof, that there are no issues.
Okay, Prof.
Every
Prof, you
solution
have
has
asked a
issues.
rhetorical question. Let me throw this in. In 2004, I was in South Africa for 10 years of democracy, the conduct of that country's election for that year. I had covered the first non-racial elections in 1994. 1994, it was manual. At some point, the elections were supposed to have been conducted in 3 days. Persons who didn't have the ID card to validate that they were 18 years, just by merely citing them, you say, okay, this is a person who is mature enough to vote, get on the queue and vote, and they voted. Results were not transmitted electronically. But by 2004, at the IEC Center in Pretoria, you sat there in the hall and you could see the results. The board was changing. The board was changing as results were coming in from the regions. All regions. And the political party leaders and other, President Thabo Mbeki at some point came into that same IEC hall. That was 2004, 17 years ago. So, I mean, Prof, you say, because you were responding to my colleague's question, you say, look, show me one country. I've showed you one country, and they are still using it. So, what is the cost involved in transmitting the result electronically? When everybody virtually all around the country, we have access to smartphones, we have access to data, and these are persons who will be specifically trained for it.
See, look, thank you very much. To pick up South Africa. See, if you bring this particular center in Nigeria, then the first question, first and foremost, can we afford that center? That's number one. Number two, if you bring that center in Nigeria, those who are going to man this center, the Nigerian factor will creep into it. Because if you put Sadiq Abba there, Kerian will cry. I say, no. If you put Kerian there, you will comment. If you put a northerner, the southerner will cry. If you say a southerner, the northerner will cry. So you see, South Africa is coming, I don't think it's, because they are coming from a typical or a particular historical reality. In Nigeria, look, I remember, I think, either the last elections or the two previous elections, some people even claim that they had electronic transmitted results. I said, no, we did not transmit results electronically. So you see, even before you go into that venture, people have already positioned themselves to bring out results that was not transmitted. So look, I'm not saying that it's wrong, but look, even advanced countries of the world, look, they did not jump from just one process to the last process. They followed this procedure gradually. So my advice is that let's do it step by step, level by level, so that once we are there, we'll be able to celebrate it.
The problem is that when now do we know that the nation is ripe, for us to, move ahead and do what other nations are doing? I think you made a very good point that Nigerian factor may come in there. There's no doubt about that. But I also believe that with technology, you can also beat those Nigerians, who think they are smart, right? So it's also a possibility.
With all respect, South Africa had political parties, ideologically, operationally. Here, we don't have,
it wasn't the business of the political parties to mount the IEC Center. That was the Independent Electoral Commission. Dr. Brigadier Bam at the time was the chairperson of the IEC. The political chieftains, they all sat there. Bantu Holomisa, who was of the UDF, they all sat there. President Thabo Mbeki walked in. Other political leaders, white, black, brown, and colored, they were seeing the board. It was changing. It was changing. It was clear that ANC was going to win, and ANC won.
What I even thought,
hope and pray we'll reach there.
What I even thought was going to talk about is the aspect of having power. because power might just go off while the transmission is going on. And of course, that will disrupt whatever result that is coming. When the time power returns, or perhaps if you have a standby gen and put it on, people may say, look, that this result has been tampered
It's part of the
with.
Nigerian factor. That I said.
All right.
We're going to go for a break. Sorry, what you are saying now, it used to happen during the manual exercise when political parties, sometimes in the past, when they were doing their convention. So the time will come to count the manual ballots that the delegates have cast. And then, so somebody, at some point, everybody's in the hall there, at some point, the light will just go off. By the time you come back, you see that the ballot have been passed.
All right, we are on Good Morning Nigeria, courtesy of the network service of NTA. We want to take a short break now. When we come back, we'll continue. Well, we are back on the program, and there's now time for us to get the view of Sazer on the issue of electronic transmission very briefly. But the main question actually would border on some of the points raised by Itodo in his opening comments, where he talked about Inec having more power, so being more independent in the real sense of it, perhaps to have power to reject candidates who did not pass through validly conducted primaries, and also for Inec to have the ability to deploy security personnel during elections.
Okay, the first part of your question, let me quickly respond, and I agree with Professor Sadiq in quite a number of the things he has said, but I don't share his pessimism about our capabilities, the nation's capabilities. The card reader actually has, if it's reconfigured, can actually transmit results. For now, it's only used for accreditation, but it can actually transmit results. Inec has the process of getting tablets now, the ZPad, that can actually be used for voting and can be used for transmitting results. And I don't know what I get the impression that there's no electronic voting proposed, but it's internet voting that is not actually proposed. So let me correct that impression. Internet voting is not a no in the bill as it stands, but there's some measure of electronic voting. The potential for chaos is where there's a discrepancy between the things that are done electronically and the things that are done manually, which will supersede the other. As acknowledged earlier on, machines have their own vulnerabilities. It may be innocuous, in other words, it's a failure of the machine manufacturer's fault, but it may also can be man manipulated, as it were. So those are the issues. Then Samson is quite right on just about everything he has said. And I think it was in answer to your question about drafting. Yes, indeed. You can provide a framework law, and I'm one of those who is proposing that a framework law be our approach. In other words, technology is so dynamic, it changes all the time. So why don't you just provide a framework law? They tried to do that in one of the clauses, saying that voting at an election shall be determined as determined by the commission, by Inec. Now, Inec can determine anything it wants to, but you have already said the person should come, open the ballot box in full glare of the people, which is an analog manual process. He should count the ballot paper. They should be serially numbered. They should do this. They should do that. They should count each one. The presiding officer shall stamp and sign a manual process. So you cannot put that, constricting it, and then in another clause saying that it can fix the procedure, because in too much detail, the Electoral Act is too detailed in that regard. You can do a framework, but I understand his fears. There must be certain guarantees written into the law to say, for example, secrecy of the ballot must be maintained at all times, for example, But if the issue of saying you don't use, I think the wording of the present bill, it says card reader actually, but when we raise this concern, it's now said, or any other technological device. So that gives some latitude to the commission. And a framework law is certainly better and it's more flexible. But some other people argue that, look, lawmaking is the function of the National Assembly. Don't give that lawmaking to an executive unelected body like Inec. But these days, I think the strict division of powers, Montesquieu, as you're well aware, has espoused 200, 300 years ago. Things have changed. So there's a lot of rulemaking, which is akin to lawmaking, but provide a framework, and then we can work with that framework. The framework is the skeleton. The blood, the cells will come from Inec through regulations and guidelines. And that is more malleable. And once there's any problem with it, it can more easily be reformed than going to National Assembly. It's taking us 2.5 years. We're still on electoral reform. If you're going to count the pre-2019 period, it's taking us 4 or 5 years. We still haven't gotten an act yet.
Okay. Well, there's the other leg of the issue raised by Sam Itodo. I want Timipre Allison to come in here. And that has to do with the proposal to empower INEC to validate the nomination of candidates. We see what is playing out in Anambra now. Too many parallel congresses. Sometimes 2 or 3 candidates are emerging and everyone beating his or her chest that the valid person who has come out of this process. Well, Samson Itodo is suggesting, look, let the power go to INEC. I was just wondering, in the past, INEC used to have such powers, or even during the transition eras that we had during the military. Candidates were being disqualified on air. Just on election day, you have so and so person have been disqualified before the powers were now removed and now donated to the judiciary, as it were, by way of judicial review. If INEC were to exercise those powers as proposed in the current reform, and indeed INEC is so empowered to validate the nomination of candidates, and then disputes arise from the nomination of candidates, because the fact that INEC has the powers does not mean that candidates or contestants for a candidacy are thereby disempowered from pursuing their rights in court. So the candidate goes to court, and then in the meantime, you have, say, 180 days to the election. The process is ongoing. I don't know how we can speed up the entire process. It's a pre-election matter. It can go on. I don't know whether the Supreme Court itself can, if the parties decide to get up to the Supreme Court. Now the elections take place, and a candidate, who was dissatisfied, or a party that was dissatisfied says, look, we were not on the ballot, or we're not supposed to be. I know that one can answer that question and say, well, it is the party that the votes go for. But suppose all of these complications come up, whether party or otherwise, or INEC rules that, look, party X, you have no candidate at all. How do we get over that so that we're not back to square one, which we're trying to move away from?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point Itodo raised, and one that is really, really important. Currently, I too do not think it is appropriate for INEC to just sit there and then accept any candidate, irrespective of how the party brought those candidates, and then put them there before election. Do not forget that post-election, that becomes a problem. Sometimes INEC declares a winner who may have emerged via fraudulent means, so the court says that candidate is no longer validly elected. So for me, INEC should have that power. I believe so. They should have that power. But this bill should clearly state that INEC should constitute maybe a special committee. I don't know how the membership will be drawn, that will look at each of these cases. So when the parties send in a nomination and there are petitions, these committees will look at the petitions and then get reports from INEC observers who were in those primaries, and then make very logical and valid decisions. Then now we have a little space between when candidates are to be submitted, the list of candidates is to be submitted, and when elections should hold. If between that period, the candidates who feel, oh, INEC may have disqualified us unduly, go to court, and then the court makes a decision, then we still have time before the election. But the idea of saying, the party decision is final and proceed to election, and then tomorrow we are in court upturning the will of the people, becomes for me a major problem. So I agree very much with Itodo. INEC should have that power, but in a way that it cannot be by fiat, so it is not abused.
Okay. Let's bring in Prof again, not necessarily on the issue of powers that INEC should possess this time around, but on the electoral spending. Nigeria is known to be one of the African nations where a humongous amount of money is being spent during electioneering campaigns. And of course, even in the registration of those who wish to contest for different positions of authority, like the governorship elections, National Assembly elections, of course, presidential election, and what have you. But we have a benchmark for presidential election, which is 15 billion naira. Is that on the high side? And if not, what kind of adjustment will you expect, or clause will you expect to be in the current reform that is going on?
First and foremost, I think generally or globally, elections is an expensive venture globally. In Nigeria, unfortunately, the most lucrative industry is the political industry. The democratic industry in Nigeria is the most lucrative. If you want to invest if you have 15 billion that you want to invest in Nigeria, don't invest it in the economic sector, because the returns on investment is abysmally poor and there is no certainty from the economic point of view. But if you invest it in the political or democratic sector and you succeed, you are able to get that office, you are very certain and sure of your returns on investment in multiple terms. So is 15 billion expensive to campaign for Nigerian presidency? Well, ideally, if you're talking about idealistic thinking, it's expensive. But in reality, it's not. Because if you look at the demands of a candidate, as a presidential candidate in Nigeria, you must tour at least 36 states of the federation. And you're not touring that states alone. You must carry the national campaign committee of your party, your friends, and you fly by air, you lodge in hotels, you feed, you understand? You provide security, and these securities are not free. You pay for the security. You pay for coverage, media, whatever. Some of them go, even Nigeria, you include the Nigerian spiritual factor there, the so-called malams and the pastors who pray for you. So see, if you factor this thing, at worst, if you put half a billion per state, times 36, it's more than 15 billion. And that is all that I mentioned, excluding the, what do you call it, the PR, the democratic PR in Nigeria, where you settle traditional rulers, religious leaders, elders in the society, you understand, etc., etc.
Even those who will be at the rally.
At the rally, you mobilize them, you package them. So you see, Kerian, to be sincere, we shouldn't be penny wise, pound foolish democratically. Nigerian democracy is one of the most expensive in the whole world.
Yeah, it is expensive,
yes.
And this question is going to Sami Todo. Sami Todo, you could also make this and one of your closing thought, because we are pressed for time now. It is expensive because it also feeds corruption, and corruption feeds into it. And part of the return on investment that Professor Sadiq Abba was talking about has to do with corruption. So there's simplicity. Now, I'm wondering, in the process of this reform, how much of an input we got from the anti-corruption agencies into campaign financing limits or campaign financing regulations. If it is left so open-ended, 15 billion, who can donate to a campaign finance and who is prohibited from making donations to campaign finance? Part of the Corporate and Allied Matters Act, Companies and Allied Matters Act, parts of it are clear on this, but elsewhere, what do we know? So that monies just come from whatever and any source, nobody asks questions, you win, and then of course you have a return on investment. How can we balance the desire for attenuating corruption in our society with the fact that we recognize that elections are expensive, but at the same time, you don't have to bring in dirty money?
So this dilemma is addressed in the electoral law because it also introduces limits limits to donations that individuals can make or even institutions can make. As you know, within our laws, it is prohibited, to receive foreign.
Oh shit, Kieran, well, that's a freeze there on the
Yeah,
Zoom
I think
connection.
he's back now.
Okay, all right, back. Sam, you are back.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so within the current piece of proposed legislation, there are limitations to donations that individuals can make. We have it in the extant law, but also it prohibits, foreign funding for our elections. I think that what we need to look at is first ensure that we've got realistic spending limits. But no matter how we peg thresholds to spending limits, if the institution that is responsible for monitoring and tracking and prosecuting offenders is not strengthened, then we will just have these provisions as mere letters in our electoral law. And Inec is vested with the responsibility of tracking and monitoring campaign finances. And we have said this. The Justice Uwais Committee's reports have also said this, and it is out there, the public in public consciousness that Inec is overburdened. So should Inec have that responsibility of monitoring and tracking campaign expenditure? My sense is that responsibility should be taken off the commission. That's why the EFCC and the ICPC have been involved in recent elections in tracking vote buying. I don't know to what extent they've arrested people who have violated, this law. There are cases, in a public where we know chieftains of political parties were publicly, doling out funds or even transferring funds that under questionable circumstances. And I think that, yes, let's have this law, but I will be very interested in how the institutions that are saddled with the responsibility to implement this law and hold defaulters to account is strengthened to perform that function, because we need to demonetize our electoral process. So we create a level playing field for everybody. So we also curb, incidents of electoral corruption.
All right, Samson Itodo, I just hope that we could have more time to delve into further intricacies of this particular topic, because of course we have been unable to exhaust this, if you ask me, because there are certain issues left untouched. So at this point we're pressed for time, and so we call it a day on this edition of Good Morning Nigeria, but not without appreciating all our guests who actually made their valid contributions to the conversation. First, Oluole Osaze Uzi, we thank you indeed for coming as always. He's the former Director of Voter Education and Publicity of Inec. Temipure Allison, we also appreciate you. He's the Head of Programs and the Center for Democracy and Development. Now, Director Yaga Africa, Samson Itodo, thank you indeed for joining us via Zoom. And also, so it's been so interesting to have Sadiq Abba, Professor Sadiq Abba, who is the Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Abuja. Prof, also thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
All right, so that's it for today on Good Morning Nigeria. Tune in again tomorrow. We urge you, same time, 7 in the morning. Until then, do look